Once again, folks, welcome to a virtual visit with Edgar Allan Poe. My name is Tom Roach, as I have said many times now, and I'm Director of Interpretation and Programs for Gore Place, the late 18th, early 19th century historic estate in Waltham, Massachusetts. www.goreplace.org to learn more. It's a nonprofit organization dedicated to the preservation of the 50-acre Gore estate and to the promotion of the estate as a community resource. And your tickets purchased today are going to help with that mission. So on behalf of the board, the staff, the members, and friends of Gore Place, I say thank you. Today, we are pleased to host a visit with one of New England's great authors. We can claim Mr. Poe as he was born not far from here in Boston in the year that our own Christopher Gore served as governor of Massachusetts. In fact, Mr. Poe was born in a house just across the common from the State House where Christopher Gore served and the home that he shared with his wife, Rebecca Amory Payne Gore, at number 9 Park Street. You know Boston, you know number 9 Park Street, famous restaurant. The year I'm talking about was 1809, and the date was January 19th, just a few days from today. It will be the anniversary of Mr. Poe's birth. I won't mention how many years it is, it's not polite. There is another interesting coincidence in the two men's lives. In 1827, the year that Mr. Gore died, Mr. Poe returned to Boston and published his first book, a collection of poems which was signed simply by a Bostonian. So he himself claimed the city. Can't get away from it. He wrote it in a book. Mr. Poe is a noted author of fiction, poetry, a talented editor and literary critic, and we are delighted that he has come to us today. So won't you join me in welcoming Edgar Allan Poe? Mr. Poe, are you there?
Gaily bedight, a gallant knight, in sunshine and in shadow, had traveled long, singing a song in search of El Dorado. But he grew old, this knight so bold, till o'er his heart a shadow fell, as he found no spot of ground that looked like El Dorado. And when his strength failed him at length, he came upon a pilgrim shadow. Shadow, said he, where can it be, this land of El Dorado? Over the mountains of the moon, down the valley of the shadow, ride, boldly ride, the shade replied, if you seek for El Dorado. Good evening. I am called Edgar Poe, and I am quite grateful for the opportunity to meet with you today in the 21st century, just 2 days before the anniversary of my birth in Boston. Yes, I was born in Boston, though I am heartily ashamed of the fact. This afternoon, I would like to share with you some of my writings, perhaps some that will be familiar to you, but I hope at least to share one that is not so familiar to you. I started with a poem called El Dorado. That poem was published in 1849 in Boston, just a few months before my death. Excuse me, to be clear, I am quite dead. Although I was born in Boston, I made my career in literature in several other cities. I started in Richmond, Virginia, for example, which is where I was mostly raised, and then in Baltimore, and then in Philadelphia, and also in New York City. Philadelphia perhaps saw my most prolific period, and many of the works which are familiar to you were written or published while I lived in Philadelphia, including the story I would like to start with. Now, this story dates to the year 1842 and was published while I was the editor of the magazine in which it was published. I believe I can share with you what that would have looked like. The magazine was based in Philadelphia and was called Graham's Magazine. And in fact, A magazine in the 1840s looks somewhat different. This is, in fact, an 1842 edition of Graham's magazine, and it includes the story, which I will read to you now. The story is called The Mask of the Red Death. And you will pardon my irreverence for the year in which I am reading now. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the redness and horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores, all ending in death. All was marked by scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim. But the Prince Prospero, he was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massive hammers and welded the doors shut. They resolved to leave means neither of ingress nor egress to the sudden impulses of despair or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to the contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were dancers, musicians, wine. All these and security were within. Without was the Red Death. And it was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade, held in an imperial suite of 7 rooms. But Prince Prospero loved the bizarre, and these rooms were irregularly arranged, such that the vision could see only 1 or 2 rooms at a time. Each room was complemented with a tall and narrow Gothic window of stained glass, colored to match the prevailing color of the chamber. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange, the 5th with white, the 6th with violet. The 7th apartment. The 7th apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decor. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Each room was lighted not with a lamp or candle. Instead, a heavy tripod of fire projected its rays through the tinted glass and so glaringly illuminated the room, causing a fantastic appearance. But in the black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered that there were a few of the company bold enough to set foot within it. It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang. And when the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note that at each lapse of an hour, the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance. And thus the waltzers ceased their dancing. And while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that even the giddiest grew pale. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. Ashamed at their own nervousness and folly, each vowed that the next chiming of the clock would not disrupt their masquerade. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and then came the same discomfort as before. Oh, but in spite of these things, it was a magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There were some that would have thought him mad. He had directed the embellishments of the 7 chambers, but it was also his own guiding taste which had given character to the masqueraders and their costume. Oh, be sure, they were grotesque. There was much glare and glitter. There were delirious fancies. There was much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. But in the final of the 7 chambers, there are now none of the maskers who venture into the ruddier light of the blood-tinted panes amid the blackness of the sable drapery. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life. And the revel went whirlingly on, until at length there commenced the sounding of midnight upon the clock. And then the music ceased, as I have told, and the movements of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock. And thus it happened, perhaps, that more of thought crept, with more of time, into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who reveled. And thus, too, it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had become aware of the presence of a masked figure, which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. And the rumor of this new presence, having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz or murmur, expressive of surprise, and finally of terror, of horror, and of disgust. Now, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited. But the figure in question had gone beyond the bounds of even the prince. You see, there are chords in the hearts of even the most reckless, of which no jest can be made. The whole company, indeed, seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger, neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse. And yet, all this might have been endured, if not approved, by the mad revelers around. But the mummer had gone so far to assume the look of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of the face, was besprinkled with the scarlet horror. The slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain its role, the stranger stalked to and fro among the waltzers. When the eyes of Prince Prospero fell upon this spectral image, in the first moment, he reacted with a strong shudder, either of terror or distaste. But in the next, his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares?" he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers who stood near him. "Who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise." Now, it was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of his guards and courtiers in the direction of the intruder, but none put forward a hand to seize him from a certain nameless awe, so that unimpeded, he passed within a yard of the prince himself. The vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank away, and the stranger made his way uninterruptedly through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet. Then the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers. None followed him, on account of a deadly terror that had seized upon all. And the prince bore aloft a drawn dagger, and had approached to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure. Finally, they each reached the final room when the intruder turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped, gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which instantly afterwards fell, prostrate in death, the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of the revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and seizing the mummer, gasped in unutterable terror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like mask were empty of any tangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and each died in the despairing posture of his fall, and the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the gay, and the flames of the tripods expired, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. Thank you. The Mask of the Red Death from 1842, originally published with the title spelled M-A-S-K, and then later republished with the title spelled M-A-S-Q-U-E. I chose The Mask of the Red Death because of the contemporary times you are living in. I hope you will pardon me if it seemed somewhat insensitive to make such a choice. Next, I would like to read another story of some familiarity to many of you. The story is a simple one about revenge. It dates to the year 1846, and it is called The Cask of Amontillado. The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as best I could, but when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. He had a weak point, this Fortunato. He prided himself upon being the greatest connoisseur of wine. It was about dusk, one evening during the supreme madness of the Carnival season, that I encountered my friend. He accosted me with excessive warmth, for he had been drinking much. The man wore motley. He had on a tight-fitting party-striped dress, and his head was surmounted by the conical cap and bells of a jester. I said to him, "My dear Fortunato, you are luckily met. I've received a pipe of what passes for Amontillado, and I have my doubts." "Impossible," said he. "In the middle of Carnival?" "I have my doubts, and I was silly enough to pay the full Amontillado price without consulting you in the matter. I have my doubts, and I must satisfy them." "Amontillado?" "You must be engaged. I shall find Lucchesi. He will tell me." "Lucchesi cannot tell Amontillado from a mere sherry." And yet, some fools will have it that his taste is a match for your own. "How dare..." "Come, let us go to your vaults." My friend, no, I will not impose upon your good nature. I perceive you have a severe cold. The vaults are insufferably damp. They are encrusted with nitre. Let us go, nevertheless. The cold is merely nothing. Amontillado. We hurried to my palazzo, and taking 2 flambeaux, made our way through several rooms toward the archway that led into the vaults. After passing a long and winding staircase, the bells upon my friend's cap jingling as we strode, we soon stood together upon the damp ground of the catacombs of the Montresors. The pipe? Oh, it is farther on. How long have you had that cough? My poor friend found it impossible to reply for many minutes. It is nothing. It is nothing. Come, I said with decision, we will go back. Your health is precious. You are rich, respected, admired, beloved. You are happy, as I once was. You are a man to be missed. For me, it is no matter. We will go back. You will be ill, and I cannot be responsible. Besides, there is Lucchesi. Enough. The cough is a mere nothing. It will not kill me. I shall not die of a cough. True. True. These vaults, he said as we continued, are extensive. Ah, the Montresors, I replied, were a great and numerous family. And yet I forget your family arms. Ah, a huge human foot of gold in a field azure. The foot crushes a serpent whose fangs are embedded in the heel. Good. We had passed through long walls of piled skeletons into the inmost recesses of the catacombs. Quite suddenly, my companion gave a laugh and offered a grotesque gesticulation I did not understand. You do not comprehend that you are not of the Brotherhood. You are not of the Masons. Yes, a Mason, I replied, producing from beneath the folds of my coat a trowel. You jest, but let us proceed to the Amontillado. And so we continued our route in search of the Amontillado. We passed through a range of low arches, descended, passed on, and descending again, arrived at a deep crypt. At the most remote end lay a deep recess, seemingly constructed for no particular use. Proceed, I said. Herein is the Amontillado. As he stepped forward, I rushed towards him. In a moment, I had fettered him to the granite with heavy chains. It was but the work of a few seconds to secure him to the wall, and he was too much astounded to resist. The Amontillado? Asked my friend, not yet recovered from his astonishment. True, I replied, the Amontillado. As I said these words, I uncovered a hidden quantity of building stone in mortar. With the aid of my trowel, I began vigorously to wall up the entrance of the niche. As I laid the first tier of masonry, then the second, and the third, and the fourth, I heard the furious vibration of the chain. Yet I resumed my trowel and finished without interruption the fifth, the sixth, and the seventh tier. In the narrow gap which remained, I held forth my torch, throwing a few feeble rays upon the figure within. There came from his lips a low laugh. I almost had difficulty in recognizing it as that of the noble Fortunato. Very good joke, indeed. An excellent jest. We will laugh about it at the palazzo over our wine. Over the Amontillado? Yes. The Amontillado. I continued, preparing to place the final bricks. For the love of God, Montresor! Yes, I said. For the love of God. For the half of a century, no mortal has disturbed the tomb I created for Fortunato. May he rest in peace. Now, if you are already familiar with the Mask of the Red Death or the Cask of Amontillado, please write so much in the chat box. And in fact, I'd like next to share with you one that perhaps will be less familiar to you. I believe in the 21st century, most of my readers today would think of me first and foremost as a writer of horror tales, like the two you just heard, The Mask of the Red Death and The Cask of Amontillado. And in fact, I wrote in many genres, not only in horror or what I might have called Gothic romance. In fact, multiple genres. I also wrote adventure tales, romance stories, tales set on the high seas. I wrote what today might be termed early versions of science fiction. And of course, I wrote comedies. In fact, I wrote more humor stories than horror stories. Please write in the chat box if you were familiar with that I wrote more humor works than horror works. And if you have a favorite comedy of mine, please do write that in the chat box as well. If you have any favorite comedies that I wrote, I would love to hear which ones they are. Well, perhaps I can give you an example of some of my humor. And to be clear, the story I would like to read next is one which I would like you to find humorous. And therefore, if you are compelled to laugh, please do so. I suppose for this one, I would like to read a story of mine that was published in the year 1840. This story is called The Businessman. I assure you this is not directed at Christopher Gore, who is so kindly hosting me this afternoon. The Businessman. I am a businessman. I am a methodical man. Method is the thing, after all. But there are no people I more heartily despise than your eccentric fools who prate about method without understanding it. Those who attend strictly to its letter but violate its spirit. Now, my notions upon this point might not have been so clear as they are, nor should I have been so well-to-do in the world as I clearly am, but for a fortunate accident which happened to me when I was a very little boy. I was making more noise than was necessary one day when an old Irish nurse, whom I will not forget in my will, took me up by the heels. Then, swinging me round 2 or 3 times, knocked my head against the bedpost. Now, those of you who are familiar with the science of phrenology, this will be important. A mendacious bump got up at once on my sinciput. Sinciput, the upper part of the forehead? Yes. Those of you who do know phrenology will recall that this part of the brain controls the higher thoughts of order. Hence, my affinity for system and regularity. This has in turn made me the distinguished man of business that I clearly am. Now, to be clear, if there is anything on earth I hate, it is a genius. I am not a genius. Your geniuses are all asses. The greater the genius, the greater the ass. And to this rule, there is no exception. You may tell these characters immediately by the nature of their occupations. Some are merchants or manufacturers. Some go into the cotton or tobacco trade, or any of those eccentric pursuits. Some become dry goods dealers or something of that kind. Others are lawyers, blacksmiths, physicians. Some aspire to be governor of Massachusetts. You may set each down at once as a genius and then conclude he is an ass. Now, in biography, the truth is everything. And in autobiography, it is especially so. So allow my autobiography. My name is Peter Pendulum, and I am not in any respect a genius, but just a regular businessman. My weak-minded parents wanted a genius of me. My father got me a job in the counting house of what he ridiculously termed a respectable merchant, as if there is such a thing, a capital bit of fiddlestick, that. In 2 or 3 days, I was sent home, sick with a dangerous pain in the sinciput, my organ of order. I felt grateful to the protuberance which had been the means of my salvation from that work, as well as to the kind-hearted Irish female who had originally put these means within my reach. I shall remember that fine old nurse in my will. You will recall, most boys run away from home at 10 or 12 years of age. But I was more mature. I waited until I was 16. It was then that I heard my parents talk of finding me a job as a grocer. A grocer. Only think of it. I resolved to be off forthwith and establish myself in a more decent occupation. By the time I was 18, I found myself in the profitable business of a walking advertisement for two tailors, Messrs. Cut and Come Again. Wearing the newest fashionable clothes, I turned and strutted in whatever public space I found. I charged for each customer I drove to the tailor, 6 cents for small men, 25 cents for those of medium size, and of course, a reasonable 50 cents for every fat man. The firm, however, proved themselves the basest of ingrates. I sent them a modest bill for about $3, covering the expenses of the clothes I wore, and of course, my promenading and twirling. The item chiefly disputed in this bill was the very moderate charge of 2 pennies for a dickie. This was not an unreasonable price for a dickie. The elder partner of the firm, however, suggested that this dickie was worth but a single penny. Well, it is needless to say that I stood upon the principle of the thing. Business is business. I would not be swindled out of a penny, a clear fraud of 50%. My next business was in the lucrative, respectable eyesore trade. Oh, are you not familiar with the eyesore trade? You know of instances when a rich old man or his fortunate heir or a large corporation attempts to put up a large, grand building. Well, as soon as that building project is fairly afoot by one of these parties, I would secure a nice corner of property just adjoining. Once their building is halfway up, we quickly build a poor, hideous, ugly mud hovel, to the dismay of our rich neighbor. And of course, we can't afford to take these structures down without a markup of, say, 500%. Can we? Can we? I ask the question. I ask that of businessmen. And yet, there was one rascally corporation which asked me to pay less. This very thing. This very thing. Well, after some time in jail, I then moved into the assault and battery business. I still followed my stern habits of method, which had been thumped into me by that old nurse. Indeed, I must remember her well in my will. Now, the assault and battery business is an ordinary one. In the street, I would meet with drunken men as they left a night of debauchery. It would take little to inspire their wrath, and upon every fist and knockdown, I hired a lawyer. Each lawsuit earned me some $500 or even $1,000. Quite honest money. One evening after the theater, I winked quite flirtatiously at a married woman whose husband deemed the action improper. Within moments, my left arm was dislocated, my right leg capitally splintered. I went home in high glee, drank a bottle of champagne, and sued the man for $5,000. The trouble is, you see, after court expenses, lawyers' bills, and medical costs, I was left with but $5. And soon I found the physical exactions of the assault and battery profession somewhat too much for my delicate body. So I chose to alter my line of business. I switched roles to become a curspatterer with the help of a fat, dirty little dog. Curspatterer? No, our general routine was this. After rolling in the mud, the dog would await a dandy, a well-dressed gentleman, and then smudge himself all over the gentleman's boots. Then the dandy swore very much and looked about for a shoe shiner. And there I was, full in his view, with blacking and brushes ready to shine away. We did moderately well for a time. I allowed the dog a third of the profit. He insisted upon half. This I could not stand, so we parted. I next tried my hand at organ grinding for a while, and may say that I made out pretty well. You see, I was a terrible musician. I would stroll along until somebody would pitch a coin with a request to hush up and move on. Of course, I would neither hush up nor move on for less than a shilling. After some months, I was in need of new employment, so I joined the sham post. I created a sham or fake letters, scrawled with a few lines, signing all the epistles Tom Dobson or Bobby Tompkins or whatever. I delivered the letters to the biggest houses and reminded whoever answered that postage was still owed. Nobody hesitates for paying for a letter, but I admit I had serious scruples of conscience. Soon the whole town took to cursing Tom Dobson and Bobby Tompkins. It was really awful to hear. I washed my hands of the matter in disgust. My last speculation has been in cat growing. Our town, you see, had become infested with stray cats. So much so that local officials passed the Cat Act. The law offered a reward for the humane destruction of cats, requiring their severed tails as the only proof. Naturally, I invested my whole estate into the purchase of cats. They fulfilled, let's say, the scriptural injunction at a marvelous rate. Their tails now bring me a good income. I can harvest 3 crops a year. The animals soon get accustomed to the thing and seem happy to have their appendage removed. And you see, my success has been achieved. I consider myself, therefore, a made man, a man of method, for I am a businessman. Well, I hope you found some humor in that tale. I had a writing career of about 20 years, dating from my first book, which was published the same year that Christopher Gore died in 1827, a book called Tamerlane and Other Poems by a Bostonian. That book of poems drew no attention whatsoever. In fact, I was not particularly well known for my writings other than my literary criticism for most of my life until about 1845. In 1845, I published a poem which became my most popular verse, a poem called The Raven. But I certainly wrote more prose works than poetry. What surprises many people is today I believe my most famous short story was one of my least famous in my lifetime. This is a story that was published in a Boston-based magazine called The Pioneer, which lasted only 3 issues before going out of business and had a very, very small circulation, regionally only in the Boston area. Very few people would have read this story, and it was not really republished in my lifetime. The story I would like to conclude with is one that you know much better than any of my contemporaries did. This story is called The Telltale Heart. True. Nervous. Very, very, very dreadfully nervous. I have been and am, but why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not dulled, not destroyed them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken, Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object? There was none. Passion? There was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. For his gold, I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, yes, it was this. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold, and so, by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of his eye forever. Now, this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing. But you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight. I was never kinder to the old man than in the whole week before I killed him. And every night about midnight, I opened his door, oh, so gently. I first put in a dark lantern, all closed so that no light shone out. And then I cunningly put in my head. I moved slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the doorway, enough to see the old man lying on his bed. Would a madman have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously, oh, so cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights, every night, just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work. For it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning I called him by name in a hearty tone and inquired how he had passed the night. So you see, he would have been a very profound old man indeed to suspect me. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph to think that there I was, opening the door little by little, and the old man not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea. And perhaps the old man heard me, for he moved in the bed suddenly, as if startled. He sprang up in bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For another hour, I did not move a muscle. And in the meantime, I did not hear the old man lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed, listening. Presently, I heard a slight groan, And I knew that it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief. Oh no, it was the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul. I knew the sound well. I knew what the old man felt. And I pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise. When he had turned in his bed, his fears had been ever since growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, it is nothing but the wind in the chimney. It is only a mouse crossing the floor. Or it is merely a cricket which has made a single chirp. Yes. Yes, he had been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but he had found all in vain, all in vain. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing the old man lie down, I resolved to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a single dim ray, like the thread of the spider, shot from out the crevice and fell upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, all a dull blue with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray, as if by instinct, precisely upon the damned spot. And now, have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over acuteness of the senses? Now I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldier into courage. But even yet I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. Meantime, the hellish sound of the heart increased. It grew quicker and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous. So I am. Now this strange noise excited me to uncontrollable wrath. Yet, for some minutes, I refrained and kept still. But the beating grew louder. I thought the heart must burst. And now, a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once. Once only. For many minutes, the heart beat on with a muffled sound until at length it ceased. The old man was dead. I examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. The old man was dead. His eye would trouble me no more. If still you think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head, the arm, the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all within the scantlings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot, whatever. I had been too wary for that. When I had made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking on the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men, who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. The officers had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled, for what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man, I mentioned, was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search. Search well. I led them at length to his chamber. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But ere long, I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears. But still they sat and still chatted. The ringing became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definiteness until at length I found the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I now grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice. Yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, not such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with a heavy stride, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men, but the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore, I swung the chair upon which I had sat and grated it upon the boards, but the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, louder, louder. And still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God, no, they heard, they suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think, but anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now again, hark. Louder, 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 louder! Villains! I shrieked. Dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here is the beating of his hideous heart. In a moment, I would like to take any questions you may have for me. Perhaps you have questions about my life, my associations, the time in which I lived. Perhaps you have questions about my writings, perhaps some of the selections I chose for tonight, or perhaps you have questions about works I did not read tonight. While you are thinking up some wonderful questions for me, I will conclude with a poem that was not published in my lifetime, a poem that was in fact published 2 days after my death. It is one which will be familiar to you. It was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden, she lived with no other thought than to love and to be loved by me. I was a child, and she was a child in this kingdom by the sea. But we loved with a love that was more than love. I and my Annabel Lee, with a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted her and me. And this was the reason that long ago in this kingdom by the sea, a wind blew out of a cloud, chilling my beautiful Annabel Lee, so that her high-born kinsman came and bore her away from me to shut her up in a sepulchre in this kingdom by the sea. The angels, not half so happy in heaven, went envying her and me. Yes, that was the reason, as all men know in this kingdom by the sea, that the wind came out of the cloud by night, chilling and killing my Annabel Lee. But our love, it was stronger by far than the love of those who were older than we, of many far wiser than we. And neither the angels in heaven above nor the demons down under the sea can ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabel Lee. For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And the stars never rise, but I see the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And so all the night tide, I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, in her sepulchre there by the sea, in her tomb by the sounding sea. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me this evening. And I would like to answer any of your questions that you might have for me. I should not say any, some of your questions that you may have for me.
Hello, Mr. Poe. Thank you so much. I'm going to try to be moderator here. I have some questions, and there's some folks that are talking in the chat as well. And so if you give me a moment, I'm going to see if I can start with Reed would like to know, Mr. Poe, this may be a difficult request. As a teen, I fell into the Poe pit through Reader's Digest condensed books. Clearly, there's a long path from obscure regional publications to that ubiquitous mass publication. Can you summarize when and how your works were popularized posthumously?
It's a complicated question, in fact. And I should mention the stories that I read this evening were also the condensed versions, just to make them short enough that I could squeeze a couple more into the recitation. I did have popularity in my time, but not for the works most people would think. My most famous prose work while I was living was called The Gold Bug, which was so popular, in fact, that it was staged as a play without my permission during my lifetime. After I died, there were a number of rumors about me, and I believe some of those rumors helped elevate the stories that I wrote, and also would explain why few people seem to know my comedies. These rumors after my death seemed to focus on the negative aspects of my life, and so a number of my stories that seemed very dark became much more popular than the stories that were less dark.
Great. Anonymous attendee says, Edgar, what are some of your favorite foods and drinks?
My favorite drink was coffee. For food, my favorite food was whatever I could eat. Most of my life, I was extremely impoverished, far more impoverished than most people would presume. There were periods in my life when I only earned a couple of $100s to support myself, my wife, and my mother-in-law. The three of us served as one family household. In fact, there was one instance when I was able to arrive at a hotel when I had some means, and there were multiple types of jellies and jams. And I was very excited because I had never seen so many options for jellies and jams before.
Thomas asks, what inspired the Red Death? And then it says Ren, age 8.
Well, I think the Mask of the Red Death was one of the stories I wrote to prove a point, that literature could be written to entertain while also maintaining a life lesson, or what we would call didacticism in my lifetime. I wrote often about how having a moral to your story often cheapened the story. But The Mask of the Red Death is an example where the story itself is an enjoyable, entertaining story to read, but also conveys a message. That message, of course, is no matter how wealthy you are, no matter how hard you try to avoid it, death will always find you.
Very good. And I have another question from another anonymous attendee. What's your, this is a very open question. What's your favorite and least favorite thing about Boston?
Oh, my favorite thing about Boston is it's where my mother found her best friends. That was when she died, she left me a watercolored portrait. And on the back, she wrote to always love Boston because it was where she found her best friends. I did not find as many best friends, but I was thankful that my mother had the opportunity to have such a positive experience. My least favorite part of Boston, of course, was the writing. The poetry that was being produced in the Boston area in many ways was the opposite of how I was trying to write. As I said a moment ago, I did not believe that good literature had to have such a heavy-handed messaging like so many Boston area writers were doing. The other part of Boston writing I disliked was the Mutual Admiration Society. Boston critics would often write in praise of fellow Boston writers. And if you were not from Boston, you were very unlikely to receive positive responses from Boston critics. We called it the Mutual Admiration Society.
Very good. And another question from an anonymous attendee. Edgar, what are your views on the Irish?
On the Irish, well, in The Businessman, there is an Irish character who makes an appearance, and that Irish character serves as a maid or as a caretaker for a child, and causes the character Peter Pendulum to hit his head badly enough that he's becomes this methodical businessman. There are a few references to Irish characters in my writing. Many of them are very stereotypical. Even the fact that an Irish maid served as a caretaker would have been a stereotype in my time.
Oh, and in the comment, Kathleen says, but you are so famous now, so much more famous than Longfellow, etc.
And that would make me quite happy. Thank you for sharing that.
Patricia asks, let me see if I have, oh, excuse me, Robert asks, care to comment on the impact the death of your loved ones from consumption had on your writing?
It is a complicated question because I would argue that the impact on my writing has been seen much more strongly after my death than when I was experiencing it. My mother died when I was so young. There really was very little impact she had on my life and on my writing, other than it set me on a very difficult path moving forward. My wife died in 1847 of tuberculosis, and certainly I had some negative experiences as a result of that and some negative emotions. But the story I wrote that most closely is inspired by my wife's illness and death is a story called Eleonora, in which the main message is after your loved one dies, you can find love again.
Fantastic. Patricia has a great question. Can you comment on your relationship, if any, with contemporary authors such as Charles Dickens?
I can speak about Charles Dickens, certainly. I was living in Philadelphia when Dickens came through the United States for his American tour, and in fact met with Dickens personally one-on-one, and at his hotel. And we shared stories about the state of literature, particularly in the United States. And I also had hoped that Dickens would use his influence to find me an overseas publisher in England. you may not be familiar with the difficulties with getting works copyrighted on 2 different continents in my lifetime, but it was not unusual for my stories to be, as we would say, pirated and reprinted without my permission in other countries. And I would see no return, no royalties, no payments of any kind. So my hope was that Dickens would assist in getting me a British publisher. He never did find me a British publisher. And as far as I know, he did very little work to find one. And so Dickens and I had a bit of a falling out, and we did not speak again.
I believe Dickens had the same problem copyright-wise in America.
And much of his American tour was spent criticizing the United States for having those sorts of problems. His book that he published as a result of that tour was called American Notes. And notes, of course, is a pun, which I would have appreciated because notes means not only scribblings, but also money.
And finally, Anonymous would like to know, had you not died, do you think you would have ever reunited with your first love in Richmond? Her name escapes me at the moment.
Yes, Sarah Elmira Royster was in fact my fiance. I was betrothed to her at the time of my death. Now, there was some controversy over that relationship because her family did not wish me to marry her. And certainly her grown sons from a first marriage would not have approved of me. But we were engaged. There was an engagement ring and everything. Perhaps if I had lived longer, I would have had her as my second wife.
And now I'm switching over to the chat, and there are some questions here. I'm going to read briefly through some of them. I think they found their way to the Q&A. Oh, here's a new one from Michael. Could you talk about your mystery stories? I know that others were influenced by yours, but were you influenced by anyone else's work?
No, of course not. The concept of a mystery in fiction certainly existed before me, but I created a new concept. I created what would today be termed the detective story. The difference was a mystery does not merely get solved. A detective story needs a character who will go through the efforts of finding clues and taking the reader through the efforts of solving that mystery. I created a character named Auguste Dupin, who made appearances in 3 of my stories: The Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Mystery of Marie Roget, and The Purloined Letter. And to give you an idea of the influence my character had on detective fiction moving forward, I can explain to you a little bit more about who Dupin was. Now, I should mention that the term detective did not exist in the English language when I created the first fictional detective in literature. But Dupin was a brilliant man who was socially awkward, I would say, who was often seen smoking a meerschaum pipe, and his adventures were told through a sidekick character. And if that does sound familiar to you, that is the model that Arthur Conan Doyle borrowed in creating Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson.
That's interesting. And you mentioned that he appears in 3 different stories. It's almost as if you were working towards serialization.
And someone asked me why I would not write more. And my response was, there was no joy in it. Where is the fun in unraveling a mystery that you yourself have raveled?
That's terrific. And another anonymous attendee says, has any more information come to light to solve the mystery of your death on the streets of Baltimore?
I did not die on the streets of Baltimore, and that is an important point that I would like to make. I died in a hospital, as so many other people did and do. I was found not in the streets of Baltimore, but sitting in a chair at a tavern that was being used as a polling place on Election Day. I'm afraid no new information has come forward, but I can say that most of the versions of the story that are told in the 21st century take some liberty versus the truth. I died almost certainly of some kind of medical condition, as so many other people do.
And Robert says in the chat, did you die of the bite of that rabid dog in the story you told earlier?
Oh, from the businessman. No, that dog and Peter Pendulum parted ways.
And I have a question. I noticed in some of your more macabre stories, the protagonist seems to be motivated by some fairly petty thing that is irking them.
That certainly seems to be the case. The Cask of Amontillado is an interesting example because if you look at it very carefully, there really is no strong motivation for the revenge that he takes. He merely says that he has suffered 1,000 injuries and vowed and insulted him. And that could be anything from saying something that had some long-term impact to merely in passing saying, I don't like your haircut. The same is true of the Telltale Heart. The murderer in the Telltale Heart seems only to be motivated by a strange eye on his victim. And I should mention too, one of the interesting aspects of the Telltale Heart is there really is no murder scene. We know the man is murdered. We know that he shrieks once only, but it is a matter of speculation how the murder happens. There is no blood stain, for example. And the reason I did that was because the story is not about murder. It's about something else. And that something else is really mentioned at the beginning of the story. How will you say that I am mad? The question is, the story is about, is the man sane or insane? And as he tries to prove his sanity, I hope you are convinced more of his insanity.
Very good. Anonymous says, are you a dark and macabre person in real life or just in your writing?
Neither. Again, I would like to emphasize that I wrote more humor works than horror works. I was predominantly a comedian in my writing, in my prose writing anyway. In person, I had many friends. I was invited to all the best parties, especially in New York City, because I was so fun to be around. I was often asked to recite poetry on the spot, and I was a very entertaining person to be around. So I would argue that I was neither macabre nor is the majority of my writing.
And then let's see. We have Kathleen says, I'm so sorry you were unable to see the fruits of your labor. And I think was there another question? No, I think maybe those are all the chats and questions. If anyone else has a question, I think you have a moment or two left. Well, since you have eternity, right? I mean, you have
I have to get back eventually.
have to get back eventually, okay. If no one else has any questions, I want to thank you, Mr. Poe, for coming today and for cheering us up. Despite the tone of some of your stories, I think it was a wonderful event. I want to thank all of the people that came and attended and were so kind and asked questions and made lovely comments. And I hope we can do this again soon. I will say that there are some wonderful comments coming in. Thank you, sir. Bravo from Robert to everyone. And again, Mr. Poe, thank you so much.